The park was empty when I arrived. It was always empty this early in the morning, except for the joggers who ran past without stopping, their earbuds in, oblivious to the world. The air smelled of fresh cut grass, and the playground swings creaked softly in the breeze. I liked it here. It was one of the few places where I could think, where I could breathe, where I sat down on my usual bench near the basketball court. It wasn't anything special, just an old wooden bench with peeling paint, but it was mine, or at least I felt like mine. I came here every morning before school, before the city woke up and reminded me that I was different. I took out my notebook and started writing. That was what I did. I wrote stories, poems, letters to people who would never read them. It was the only way I knew how to make sense of the world. The only way I knew how to take all the anger, the fear, the exhaustion, and turn it into something else. I was halfway through a poem when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I looked up. A police officer stood a few feet away, his hand resting on his holster. My heart started to race. I hadn't done anything wrong. I was just sitting here writing in my notebook, but I knew that didn't matter. It never mattered. The officer tilted his head slightly. "What are you doing here?" I swallowed hard. "Just writing." His eyes flicked to my backpack, then to my hands, then back to my face. He didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stood there, watching me like I was a problem he needed to solve. "This your neighborhood?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes, sir." He studied me for another long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I sat there, frozen, until he was gone, until I was sure he wasn't coming back. Then I packed up my things and left. By lunchtime, I had almost convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. Almost. I sat with my best friend Andre in the cafeteria, pushing my food around on my tray. He was talking about basketball tryouts, but I wasn't really listening. "You good?" he asked, nudging my shoulder. "Yeah." I lied. He gave me a look, the kind of look that said he knew I was lying but wasn't going to push. Not yet. I forced myself to take a bite of my sandwich, chewed, swallowed. It's still trying out. "Yeah," he said. "Coach said we need more shooters. I've been working on my three-player." I nodded like I cared, like I was actually hearing the words. But all I could think about was the way that officer had looked at me, the way he had studied me, like he was trying to decide if I belonged. I hated that feeling, the feeling of being watched, the feeling of being judged. I had spent my whole life trying to make myself smaller, quieter, less threatening. I got good grades. I stayed out of trouble. I did everything I was supposed to do. And still, it wasn't enough. It was never enough. That night, I told my mom what happened. She was washing dishes, her back to me, but I could see the way her shoulders tensed. "Did he say anything else?" she asked. "Yeah. Did he touch you?" I She let out a slow breath and turned to face me. "I'm sorry, baby." I looked down at my hands. I didn't do anything wrong. I know. I was just sitting there. I know. She walked over and pulled me into a hug, pressing a kiss to the top of my head like she used to when I was little. But I wasn't little anymore, and the hug wasn't going to fix this. The next morning, I didn't go to the park. I couldn't. Instead, I went straight to school, my stomach in knots, my mind racing. Andre noticed, "You all right?" I hesitated. Then I told him. He listened without interrupting, his jaw clenching slightly. When I was done, he shook his head. "They always do that," he muttered. "They see us sitting somewhere, standing somewhere, breathing somewhere, and they act like we're a threat." I didn't know what to say. Andre leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "Remember Marcus?" I nodded. Everyone remembered Marcus. He had been a senior when we were freshmen, one of the best basketball players our school had ever seen. He had a full ride to a Division I school, a future. And then one night he had been walking home from practice when a cop pulled him over. They said he matched the description. They said he resisted. They said he reached for something. And just like that, he was gone. I shivered. "Yeah, I remember." Andre exhaled. This city doesn't love us, man. It never has." I didn't argue, because I knew he was right. I avoided the park for a week, maybe longer. But eventually, I went back, not because I wanted to, because I had to, because it was my park, my bench, my space. I sat down and opened my notebook. My hands were shaking, but I wrote anyway. I wrote about the way the world looked at me. I wrote about the way it felt to be feared for nothing. I wrote about Marcus. I wrote about my father's warnings. I wrote about my mother's tired eyes. I wrote about Andre's anger. I wrote about the things I was afraid to say out loud. And then slowly I felt it. Not peace, not safety, but something close. Something like power, because they could look at me however they wanted. But they couldn't take my words. And as long as I had my words, I had some they could never take away.